The title question of this video. What is folkism? I wish I could say it's racist paganism, but then I'd get a bunch of folkists howling in my comments section about how they don't actually hate anyone, so here we are. Let's do this. Kairete! Got a new fan art submission on the Discord from Magpie and Fox. I have the bridge. Thank you so much for your artwork. It means a lot to me. A while back, I did a collaborative live stream on Hammered Out with Ocean and Surus, linked to the iCard above, covering an organization within Hellenism that they and I considered Folkist. Although within Reconstructionist circles it's well known, folkism is a term that has prompted dozens of questions on Twitter and in pagan spaces from new practitioners and folkists themselves. It's such a broad span of beliefs and topics that defining it alone was the first challenge. Thankfully, I had the help of Ocean Keltoy and another mutual friend to hammer out a good definition. We propose that folkism is the belief that ancestral ties give benefit, privilege, or access to a religious tradition, especially in lieu of a living culture. That's a mouthful, so let's break it down a bit. Ancestral ties here often means either bloodlines or adopted family lines, though there are many folkists that deny the legitimacy of the latter. Some folkists believe that ancestral ties to a particular continent, regardless of the culture of upbringing, automatically grants privileges to potential adherents, while others state that only those with these ties can practice the faith in question. Some people believe that people with ancestral ties to a long-dead culture should be allowed to dictate who is and is not a proper adherent of the faith, and some believe that only those with these ties can get the closest relationship to the gods or become priests. It's a complicated topic. What ties all of them together is the belief that in some way, genetics can be substituted for culture or gives one a deeper look into the culture without actual upbringing in said culture. In other words, your 23andMe could give you a better relationship with the gods, or somehow limits which gods would even be willing to engage in praxis with you. Which, when you think about it, makes absolutely no sense. Why would beings possessing a degree of awesome power and greatness and possessing power beyond our mortal comprehension be somehow limited by the chromosomes you just so happen to inherit? It's ridiculous to believe that the nucleotide sequence in your cells could somehow be that much more powerful than beings that have influenced humanity for millennia. In a world like that, future self-biohackers would merely need to isolate the controlling gene and splice it into our DNA to get a direct line to the gods. Although that's a really messed up sci-fi premise, I think it has little to do with modern reality. Folkism is most visible and well known within heathenry. I've actually invited my friend Wolf the Red on to give a brief summary of his experience with Folkists, especially the group known as the Sun Eaters.
Thanks, Allie. Hey everyone, I'm Wolf the Red, and as Allie mentioned, Folkists have been trying to use heathenry to push their harmful ideology since it was revived last century. A few groups have gotten some major momentum, and one such group I wanted to talk about is the biker club, the Sun Eaters. They are northern-based and have a solid number of members. The interesting thing about them is they are a proxy group for the Wolves of Vinland. Yes, that Wolves of Vinland, the Nazi organization that promotes Operation Werewolf. They use their racist and folkish rhetoric to prey on people who are down on their luck, seen as outsiders, and may not have a good support system. They build you up and make you feel like family. It's very cult-like and checks off a few of the bite model areas. But they have a focus on strength and white identity and having no fear and all that macho bullshit you hear Nazis spew. I lost a really cool friend to them because of the tough time she was having in life. She was a crafty witch, but was struggling in ways I could not help. After a summit meeting she went to, that was it. She was lost that quick. They seduced her to this way of thinking, and I never saw her again. She moved north with her new Nazi boyfriend. After that, I got involved with a group that was working to infiltrate them and try to get information on how they operate. We were successful in crippling some of their more public spaces and cash flow, but I hear they have moved into private areas and are less vocal these days. Folkish ideals can be extremely harmful, and while not overtly racist, do use the same rhetoric that slowly tries to change the way you feel about racial diversity. I'm gonna let Allie continue from here, but please remember, go big or go home.
Thanks, Wolf. He made a video over on his channel where he dispels the folkish myth rhetoric from a Reconstructionist heathen perspective, link in the iCard above. Ocean Keltoy also did a video from his perspective as a heathen, where folkism is both more well-known and far more overt than in Hellenism, and the debate has been much more fierce in that community due to the wide range of folkish expressions of belief. He does a really good job covering the history of folkish movements within white supremacy. It's well worth checking out, link in the iCard above. The most common objection folkists give when confronted on their problematic beliefs is a comparison to Native American religious protectionism, especially that of the Lakota and the Cherokee. So before we get too much deeper into the Hellenic expression of this stuff, let's take a look at how defensible the comparison is. In Asatru, a Native American spirituality, Stephen McNallen gives the following excerpts of experiences leading folkists to his movement.
My friend Stephen is one such person. Here's his story. In 1975, I was at a powwow on the Rosebud Sioux Indian Reservation in South Dakota. My girlfriend and I and another couple had been there for a couple of days enjoying the dancing, drumming, and craft work. I had struck up a conversation earlier with a gentleman who turned out to be one of the Sioux elders who helped organize the event. Later on that evening, he came over to me and asked me if I hadn't had a good time. I answered, yes, very much so. Then he said, I'm glad to hear that, but you'll have to leave now. Afraid that I had violated some rule or committed a social faux pas of some kind, I asked why. He replied, because we're about to perform a religious ceremony, and it's only for Indians. I replied that I understood. As we were walking away, he walked beside me. At the entrance, he put his hand on my shoulder, smiled, and said to me, you're not going to find what you're looking for here. You need to drink from your own well. I shook his hand and left. It would be another 20 years before I understood what he meant by this statement. I discovered Edrin Thorson's A Book of Troth in a bookstore, and was reading through it when the Sioux elder's words came back to me and struck me like a thunderbolt. This was it. I was finally drinking from my own well. I had found my way home. Another friend, Ed, had this story to tell. I was talking with the family counselor who happened to also be a Hopi medicine woman. In the course of our conversation, I mentioned that I admired Native American culture and wanted to study the wisdom of her spiritual path. Looking at me with a little smile in her eyes, she asked, do you have any Indian in you? Pausing only a moment, I replied that no, I was just about 100% German. Her response was immediate. Honey, the Indian way is my way, not yours. Here, let me show you some people who can help. She put me in contact with the Asatru Folk Assembly, and I've been here ever since.
I'm going to preface all of this by stating that although I have a fair bit of indigenous ancestry and some education from family on the culture of my tribe, what I'll be discussing here largely concerns indigenous people from tribes not my own who have been exploited for centuries. I'm going to do my best to use quotes from elders or practitioners of these tribes, and I ran the script by active members of Plains tribes before recording this video. We are all different peoples and cannot speak for each other even if we feel kinship. With that out of the way, let's talk about the Sioux. I have no doubt people from this book have had these experiences on reservations, but the reasons why are complicated historically by generations of eugenics-driven public policy. Blood quantum, for example, was instituted both to limit tribal membership and to exclude African-American freedmen who had intermingled with native tribes. Many tribes in pre-colonial times had more of a cultural view of native identity, where one who spoke the language and practiced the customs of the group belonged to that group. This is evident even during colonial times when propaganda was disseminated by the US government to stop people from running off to join tribes because the quality of life in tribal community was much better. Blood quantum is also based, in the US at least, on having ancestors who enrolled on one of several tribal roles. The most famous of these are the Miller and Dawes rolls, which primarily dealt with the so-called 5 civilized tribes of Oklahoma, and the Cherokee tribes respectively, but there were others throughout history. A major problem involving these rolls was that many natives of mixed ancestries were afraid to approach those enrolling for fear of being forced to relocate to reservation lands, especially given the long history of the US government breaking treaties it made with Native American tribes. Another issue, discussed in Obijwe author Anton Truer's interview with NPR, was that during land disputes in the 1900s, a number of pseudoscientific methods were used to determine, quote, who is of full native blood, unquote, by eugenicists out to strip tribal members of their land and rights. Of 5,000 native residents tested at the White Earth Reservation in northwest Minnesota by so-called scientists Albert Jenks and Ales Hrdlicka, only 126 were coded as full blood. They used methods like cranium measurement, skin scratching and discoloration, and cheekbone measurement. requirements. And that weeding out of people is still used as the basis of enrollment on that reservation today. There are many stories like this throughout the United States that taint the idea of blood quantum as a reliable indicator of what makes someone indigenous, but many tribes still use it to this day. Why? One reason that stands out is financial struggle and perceived benefit. Having indigenous ancestry gives someone access to a finite pot of resources through both the tribal government and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, meant to help rectify these staggering problems of poverty and undereducation found on reservations. Also, some tribes have casinos on their lands that distribute a portion of their profits to tribal members, which gives a financial incentive to privilege who can and cannot be a part of the tribe. Many tribe members defend it as a means to survival, while others feel that its use is ultimately going to kill off what remains of tribal identity and culture. The determination of what makes one indigenous is so fluid and complex between tribal membership in blood, participation in culture, and acceptance by said culture that no one indigenous person is going to give you a solid answer as to what indigenous identity even means. Blood quantum has also become a sort of status symbol among some natives on reservations. It's one of the few ways folks can measure what it means to be native when our traditions and language were illegal, and attempts to preserve them resulted in arrests, fines, and other abuse on the part of the US and Canadian governments. All the while, theft of cultural traditions for profit carried on by a white majority fascinated by the oeuvre of native culture with little care for the actual humans that culture belonged to. For example, Sundance ceremonies, sweat lodges, smudging, and vision quests have become synonymous with the New Age movement over the last century, but not without objection from the tribes these practices were stolen from. Each one of these sacred practices have ties to the land, culture, and religious beliefs of a living people, and require years of training under a holy man to fully understand and implement. Many people who are not of Lakota descent have claimed to have undergone this training and now sell expensive courses, books, and ceremonial tickets. This led in 1993 to the Lakota Declaration of War against Exploiters of Lakota Spirituality. Link in the description below to a document from 1998 with a transcript, in which the elders of the Lakota Nation declare that non-Lakota people who claim their sacred ceremonies for profit must be stopped. Although monetary compensation can be accepted by genuine medicine men for travel time and ritual items consumed in the ceremonies in some traditions, the prices charged and the perversions of ceremony put forward by these charlatans they reference distort the original content and cultural sacredness of their practice. Many Lakota in the modern day will still teach non-Lakota these practices, given that, as Leonard Crowdog says in an interview with the Sun Sentinel, "In the eyes of the Creator, we are all one. The Spirit really doesn't care what color you are as long as you are concerned with carrying on the sacred way." However, the distortions by those looking to exploit these traditions for monetary gain have caused many in these communities to call for the total exclusion of non-Indigenous peoples from religious ceremonies. Not because they're not able to access the gods and spirits, or because the Indigenous peoples are in some way privileged with this information, but because of the way their cultures have been pillaged and profited from. When someone takes a ceremony like the Sweat Lodge out of the cultural context it came from, there's a loss of its true meaning. Considering it was illegal for Indigenous peoples to practice our faiths or even speak our languages until the 70s, this is a real and ever-present concern. Not only has the profiteering not benefited the tribes directly, it's actually harmed their access to sacred materials and items needed for their ceremonies. White sage, popular in New Age circles for its purported cleansing properties, has been so over-harvested by wildcrafters out to make a quick buck off the trend that it's in danger of going extinct. Traditional harvesting practices ensure that enough of the plant remains to regrow, and these newcomers give no consideration for future use of the plant in sacred ceremonies. Beyond this, many of the New Age shops selling the sage bundles separate the smudging practice entirely from the sacred ritual and cultural context, as do most books that mention it on New Age shelves. Growing up, Silver Ravenwolf and DJ Conway both wrote about smudging as a cleansing act for ridding an area of nebulous negative energy, with barely a nod to the cultural significance and no mention of proper ceremony around the practice. As Amy Willier states in an article for the Huffington Post on the subject, smudging is ceremony, and when you're in ceremony, all parts of you need to be in ceremony. It's not something that you take lightly. Others in the same article discussed how sage was always seen as a sacred object and only used for spiritual pursuits, an attitude that reading a short card in a kit telling you that sage can be used for cleansing can't instill. It's a commodification of an ancient practice sacred to many still living cultural groups who are actively losing their ability to practice their sacred arts due to its exploitation. It's direct, tangible harm. Does this sound anything like what the Folkists are arguing? Well, on the surface it might, given that some natives are calling for the barring of non-native participation, but is there anything in that argumentation about bloodlines or a closer connection to the gods? Or is it a living people trying to protect themselves from attack by an invasive group that has oppressed them for over 5 centuries? I've linked to several articles on the subject in the description below and encourage you to come to your own conclusion. Coming back to McNallen and his followers' experiences, they most likely bumped up against folks within a tribe that has been hurt by the fight for native identity, authority and settled on the side of blood quantum, even though historically this was a requirement placed on them by eugenicist whites. I understand where they are coming from, but as another person of indigenous ancestry, I don't think that blood has anything to do with the gods, and as far as I can tell, neither did my Haida ancestors. Some Folkists will try to appropriate the statement about native peoples protecting their heritage by citing Christian exploitation and extermination of ancient cultures, as the YSCE does in their Hellenic theology book. But here's the thing. Even if some cultural practices have survived into the modern day in a Christianized form, that doesn't mean that the culture itself has survived as it has with the Lakota. And it certainly doesn't mean that people born outside Greece who merely have Greek blood can claim that cultural upbringing. The claim that Angelo Nasios makes in his article Who Defines Hellenism, that Hellenization can only be defined by ethnic Hellenes, is grounded in fallacious logic. The YSCE website itself calls the Christianization of Greece a perversion of Greek culture that must be undone, yet still lays claim to the title of Supreme Council of Ethnic Hellenes, and thereby sole claim to defining who is and is not a Hellenist. There is even a section on the site where they call other organizations within Hellenism pretenders or those actively working to undermine the YSCE's authority. Within its holy book, there are lines about Christianity as the expansionist arm of Judaism when geography could no longer contain it, which I don't need to tell my audience carries some pretty heavy anti-Semitic undertones. And Twitter posts by several members attacking detractors on the lines of race and belief speak for themselves. Many posts were lost when the above person was banned, but suffice to say it was pretty nasty. Doesn't add much credence to the "I'm not a racist" argument when friends and defenders attack others on racial grounds, does it? Big oof. Add to that the assertion that although the YSCE will not stop their members from being LGBT+, they will not marry them because the ceremony they've written has heavy reproductive symbolism, without being willing to engage on whether or not barren people who do not intend to have children can be permitted marriage. This holds true in the US as well, where the Greek Orthodox Church does not hold power and LGBT marriage is a right upheld by the Supreme Court. The argument that somehow, without any documentation, a form of Greek religion has been passed down through culture and only within the last 50 years has emerged seems as likely as family tradition Wicca did when Gerald Gardner claimed it nearly a century ago. Although we have records of the ancient traditions and some survival into the modern day of Christianized versions, we can't fully untangle the traditions from their Christianization, and trying to claim that it's some survival of ancient religion in the modern day is a little bit dubious. It's closer to syncretization, which was widespread practice in the ancient times. Although I understand the desire to reclaim what one feels should be cultural heritage that has otherwise been stolen from them, you can't claim that you have that cultural heritage because of your chromosome and expect to set bars for others who wish to participate to pass as though that culture still lives. That's just ancestral gatekeeping, and no matter how many layers of caveats you wrap around it about some good ones of other ethnic heritage that have made it in your eyes, it's still folkism. It's just folkism with apologetics. I'd invite you, if you are a member of this group, to apply the divine gift of reason from Zeus to the arguments you've been fed and really think through what you've been parroting. I know many good people who have been taken in by this awful rhetoric. It grieves me to see my community sink so low, and this is coming from a member of an exploited, still living tradition. This is a massive topic. It took hours of bouncing back and forth just to get a proper definition for the word due to the myriad and subtle ways folkism presents itself, let alone do the research necessary to properly cover it from my perspective. I hope you all find this video useful when looking at folkism in your own communities and in the communities of others, and encourage you to send it and oceans to anyone you see who is putting forward Folkist views. If you're new here and you found this useful or enjoyed it, please hit the subscribe button and cleanse the room that you're in with the notification bell. Drop down in the comments to let me know if you found the definition or explanation useful, or to yell at me because you don't like what I said if that's your speed. I know I'm probably going to annoy a lot of people from the YSCE with this one, but I'd already done a much larger expose on Cyrus's channel, so bite me? Special thanks to Gaelic Knox for their artwork as always, link in the description to their website and Twitter. Also, special thanks to my buddy Russ for doing the recording of Stephen McNallen's garbage, so I didn't have to. It means a lot to me, buddy.
Hey guys, Frustrated Atheist here. I just want to say, fuck folkism.
Thank you. You've always been an amazing ally. And special thanks to my patrons. You all are helping me get the assets I need together to make some much more detailed and scholarly content. I've got some exciting stuff down the pipeline, and I'm thrilled to be along the ride with you. And remember, faith ain't fear.